Greetings from Spain. If you're anything like me and you're in confinement right now, you're probably finding you've got lots of time on your hands. One of the things that I'm enjoying at the moment is spending time making bread, not buying it from the shop. Instead, I'm making it. I think lots of other people in Spain are as well, because right now I can't find fresh yeast in the shop when I have been, and all of the bread flour's out. There's hardly any flour left at all. So I'm making it basically with cake flour today, which isn't ideal, but it will work. And I thought it'd be fun, if you haven't made bread before, to join me. I love the way Jesus taught. He taught in really practical ways. He was very hands-on, experiential. And there's something when you do that, it really kind of gets you into what he's saying, and it helps you think in a different way. So I fancied thinking today about bread, but particularly about yeast. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a batch of dough until it leavened the whole dough. That's Matthew 13. Jesus telling a parable. It's a metaphor, it's a story, but it's a really vivid picture. So if you haven't made bread before, I challenge you to grab some flour. You need 800 grams of flour, 2 teaspoons of salt, 2 teaspoons of sugar, some yeast, about 470 millilitres of warm water, 3 tablespoons of oil. Pretty simple, very easy recipe. Now, yeast in the Bible crops up a lot. Today actually is the Passover, and we know that at the Passover, the Jewish people take unleavened bread and they eat it. And this is bread without yeast, it hasn't risen. No yeast in the dough, and so it's unleavened bread. And they were to eat this as a reminder of the first Passover when they were being brought out of Egypt, when there was no time for the bread to rise, so they made bread without yeast. And so they eat it in haste as a reminder of that first Passover. In the Old Testament, we can read in Leviticus chapter 2, for example, that when people sacrificed, they weren't to sacrifice bread with yeast in it. It was to be unleavened bread that they sacrificed. It doesn't say why that is. Some people suggest it's because live things weren't sacrificed, and yeast is a live thing. And something which is alive and can die isn't suitable for sacrifice. In the New Testament, Jesus talks about yeast several times. Some of the times it's positive, some of the times it's negative. He tells his disciples rather, Matthew chapter 16, to beware of the leaven or the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He says, beware of their false teaching and their hypocrisy. So the yeast was a picture of false teaching. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 talks about beware of the old yeast of malice and envy that can leaven the whole batch of dough. So this old yeast of malice and envy gets into the dough and it poisons and it affects the whole batch of dough. It's interesting, isn't it? So yeast can be a picture of something poisonous, something that infiltrates, something, I guess, like cancer cells that get into the body and that affect the whole body. Sin. A virus that spreads throughout the whole body, the whole world, and infects us all. The message of Easter, of course, is that Jesus is our Passover lamb, that Jesus has been sacrificed, that Jesus has freed us from this insidious virus of sin. And that's one image of yeast. But Jesus also talks very positively about yeast. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a batch of dough. Now, certainly in the Old Testament times and in New Testament times, the yeast that they would have used is very different to this kind of manufactured industrial yeast. It would have been something more like this, sourdough. This is my sourdough starter. I've had this going for 16 months now. I've kept it alive all this time, thankfully, by feeding it every day. So this sourdough is simply water and flour, 50% of each, mixed together. And every day I add a little bit more to it. And the natural bacteria in the air feeds this and it creates kind of a wild yeast. Now this sourdough mixture is unpredictable. It's not easy to use, it sometimes goes wrong, but it produces fantastic, nutty, flavoursome bread. I thought about using it now, but I'm not going to. I've got a slightly different image in my mind. But this kind of yeast, to me, when Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like yeast, that a woman took. I kind of imagine a real wild yeast. I don't know how you picture the kingdom of heaven, but for me, this is unpredictable. This is sort of outside of our control. We don't neatly package this kind of yeast. This is something otherworldly, mysterious, and it does something to the dough that we can't quite explain. Now, having said all of that, I am going to use this kind of yeast. There are different kind of leavens. You get chemical leavens, which are things like bicarbonate of soda or baking powder. And then we get yeast, which is baker's yeast, which has been specially created into a powder form. But what I really love is this kind of fresh yeast. And I'm going to open this packet in just a moment. So if you've got some flour, get your flour, and let's start getting our hands dirty at this point. You've got flour. I've mixed into this already some salt and some sugar. And this flour is lovely stuff. And I can make bread just from this by adding water to it. And I would come out with some kind of flat bread like this, an unleavened bread. But the yeast is going to do something remarkable. It's going to transform this flour. It's going to bring something into this flour which changes its very nature. Right now, this flour smells like flour. I wouldn't call it a dead smell, but it's not quite an alive smell. It's really different to the yeast. When I open the yeast, there is something in this yeast that is different. I mean, even before I start, I could take I've taken this out of the fridge. I took it out a while ago to warm up slightly. If I was now to take this in the packet and chuck it into my flour, it's not going to do much good, is it? Yeast in a package isn't going to do much. Yeast, when it stays together in one lump, isn't going to achieve much. I wonder what that makes you think. Yeast needs to be opened up. The packet needs to be opened. And then the yeast needs to be taken out. And if you smell it, it's alive. It's a living thing. It's a single cell fungus. It's alive. There's something in the yeast which is going to react with the flour and do some magical things. But first of all, it needs to be opened up. And then it needs to be crumbled. Now, I could dissolve this yeast in water. That's one way to make bread, but I like to just actually mix it in with the flour. And particularly for the purpose of this metaphor, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast taken out of its packet, scattered into the flour. I wonder what God is doing right now in the world. Even right now, we're in an uncomfortable place where our normal pattern, the normal way we've done things is being changed. We're not meeting in our churches in the same way. We've been taken out. We've been scattered. We're in our homes. I've read places like in Acts chapter 8, verse 1, where the church in Jerusalem, persecution breaks out. And we're told that the believers were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. And as they were scattered, the kingdom of God grew. Sometimes God scatters people. Sometimes God takes us out of our wrapper, out of our comfort zone, out of our institutions, out of our hierarchies, out of our leadership structures, out of our curriculum, out of our normal practices. And he scatters us for the purpose of mixing us in to the flour. It's not comfortable. Why is God doing it? What is he doing? I wonder. So we've got our flour, we're going to mix in the water. This is just water and olive oil that I got earlier. If you've got a spatula, at this point you can just mix it in. Just mixing it around. It's interesting, this yeast, it's a 25-gram pack of yeast. I weighed out 800 grams of flour. If you're good at maths, you can work out that's about 3%, slightly less, 3% of yeast to 97% of flour. doesn't seem to take a lot of yeast to affect a lot of flour. I wonder what that means. I wonder how much yeast God needs to affect the whole dough. How discouraged are we when we're small in number? But what effect can we have, just 3%, when we're truly mixed into the flour? It's an interesting picture. So, we'll get our dough into a lump. And then I'm going to put it out on the table. Let's get rid of that bowl for now. Now, at this point, I've got a lump of dough. I could just put that to rise. But actually, it's not going to work, is it? Something needs to happen. There's more of a process that needs to go on first. Now, my yeast is in the flour, and the yeast can begin its work. The enzymes in the yeast and the flour are going to begin to break down the starch and the sugar. The yeast is going to metabolize the sugar. It's going to create alcohol. Carbon dioxide is going to be given off, a gas, and that's going to form bubbles, and it's going to begin to rise. But if it rises too quickly, and the dough is not elasticy enough, it's not going to rise very well. It's going to sink back down. So this process we call working the dough. We really are working it. If you've not done this before, you can actually spend 10, 15 minutes working the dough. As I'm doing this, it's actually warming up. It's heating up the whole mixture. And as this happens, the proteins in the flour are changing. It's forming together to create gluten. That's making a strong, elasticy dough. And so when it rises, it's actually going to stay risen. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast. It needs to be taken out of its packet, mixed into the flour, and then a whole process of working it. It's not comfortable. It heats it up. It's uncomfortable sometimes. This yeast is not in its comfort zone anymore, but somehow, slowly, in this process of heating, in this process of kneading, in this process of being mixed into the flour and worked in, it's going to change the very nature of the flour. This flour is going to be leavened and the whole thing is going to rise. And in a few minutes, I'll stop. What am I going to do? I'll take it, I'll put this batch of dough back into my metal bowl. I'll get a damp tea towel or a cloth, I'll put it on top. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to stand it in the corner, in the dark. And I'm just going to leave it there to be hidden away. And in the dark, where nobody can see what's happening, the yeast is going to get to work in the dough. It's going to change it and it's going to rise it, and then I'll cook it and we'll have a loaf of bread. I wonder what this means for us. What's it like for us to be yeast? For us to be taken out of our packet, our normal ways of doing things. There's something very beautiful about this industrial yeast. It's been packaged, it's very 20th century. There's a set way of doing it. It's reproducible, it's easily manufactured, it's easy to sell, it's easy to store, it's easy to package, it's easy to communicate. Very different to my live, wild sourdough. I wonder sometimes if in our 20th century, 21st century thinking, we've allowed our understanding of the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, to be industrialized. It's lost its wildness, its unpredictability. I wonder if at times there's a temptation for us to stick together with those that we know. There's safety in the pack of yeast. There's a softness to it, there's a moistness to it. It holds together well. It smells strong and beautiful when it's together. There's a vibrancy in it, but it doesn't make bread. The yeast has to be taken out. It has to be scattered. It has to be so mixed into the flour that you can't see the yeast anymore. It's so identified in a healthy way, it's become part of the batch of dough. It's been emptied of itself, mixed in. And now this beautiful, elasticy thing is changing. It's going to begin to rise. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a batch of dough until it leavened the whole dough and caused it to rise. I wonder what God is doing right now in us as communities, in the church, in our churches, in our buildings, as they're empty and we've been scattered. It's a time, a challenging time. It's not an easy time. The dough has been heated up. I wonder if that's part of the purpose of it all. The dough is changing. The yeast almost deliberately has been scattered. I wonder what things are going to look like in a few months' time. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a man took and mixed into a batch of dough until it leavened the whole dough.